Okay, good afternoon and welcome. I hope your eyesight is good, because we have a small screen, but finally we have something. And it's a bit important because I have some maps and charts I'd like to show you. So again, thank you for joining us on this afternoon, this open lecture. It's nice to see you all here. I'll try to speak a little slowly. I know English is not your native language, but I think your English is probably better than me doing this lecture in Russian. I think you'll understand more. So today I want to talk about two of the themes that I think shape the world we live in and the international relations that we study. And those two themes are globalization and geopolitics. And I think these are really the two processes that define our world today. We live in a world which I think we can all agree is defined by networks, by flows of capital, by flows of ideas, by flows of goods, technology and culture. This is the idea of globalization. However, at the same time as this world of flows and connections, our places where we live, the countries that we live in, are also more vulnerable to new and old threats. Threats like terrorism, even things like earthquakes, bird flu, climate change. All of these have a disregard for international boundaries. However, instead of there being a kind of a rush to face these challenges, to face these transboundary challenges, I think today we are seeing as much a renaissance, a resurgence of geopolitics, nationalism, and even the rhetoric of great powers. And this rhetoric of geopolitics and great powers, it also is a defining feature of world politics. And I think there's a tension between globalization and geopolitics. And this is defining much of the contemporary world. And I think this is especially true in East Asia, and particularly the Western Pacific. And I will talk about this a little in the second half of this paper, this presentation. So I want to look at how globalization and geopolitics are changing the global balance of power. I want to suggest that in the Western Pacific there has been a renaissance. Again, people are talking again in geopolitical terms and concepts. Yet at the same time, the region is more interconnected and interdependent than ever. So we have this tension between globalization and geopolitics. So in the first part of this paper, I'll suggest a kind of a typology, some different types that I think states fit into by trying to intersect geopolitics with globalization. And through this typology, which I'll introduce, I want to bring kind of a new understanding to interactions between states in the world system, and to demonstrate that globalization affects different states in different ways. So this typology combines processes of globalization and globalization and geopolitics as a feature of international relations. So let's go to slide one, if it's like a disco. I'm sorry, it's here. Here we go. So I don't know how much you can see of this, but if you listen carefully, more importantly is you can see the maps a little later. So I draw some of this discussion from political geography, and my background's in political geography. And I think some of these concepts of political geography are helpful to understanding the world we live in today. One quite famous political geographer is John Agnew, who's based in the United States. And he suggests that he draws our attention to this interconnectedness, as many other people have done. For example, Apajirai and many other scholars of globalization have really, I think, demonstrated and convincingly that the world is more interconnected today. That globalization is changing traditional concepts of territorial sovereignty. No longer in our world today, international organizations, social movements, businesses, NGOs, they all have an effect on states, on states' policy, and on the way sovereignty is interpreted. In Agnew's words, it's very difficult today to apply the orthodox conception of state sovereignty to the different powers that we have at the local, the regional, the national, the international, and also the non-territorial level. And I want to sort of draw a bit of attention to the relative power of states in the global system. Because I think states have never been the exclusive realm of territory. Even in the past we had churches, The church was a great source of sovereign power. Today, it's arguably transnational businesses, it's NGOs, and different social movements, which really affect the policy of our states. Organizations like the European Union, have the WTO, they all have a big effect on state policy. It's no longer bounded within the space of each country or within each country's parliament. So I think we could perhaps agree that globalization has reconfigured state sovereignty in various ways. However, I think this sometimes ignores the rise in state-centric, state-focused geopolitical thinking in the world today. And in this, I want to intersect globalization and geopolitics to try and help us explain some of today's processes and events in the world. So I think in the case of globalization first, there are a number of indicators to determine how integrated states are in the global system. For example, we can look at investment by multinational companies, social engagement, personal connections between states. And there's different measures of globalization. And you can, there's one of the most popular, well-known measures is done by a Swiss organization, the Swiss Economic Institute. And this has collected different indices, different indicators of economic flows, economic restrictions, information flows, personal contact, and also cultural aspects of globalization. And I think this globalization index is a good idea, is a good indicator of how state sovereignty is being changed. If you are more open to globalization, likely your sovereignty is likely to be, your national sovereignty, state sovereignty is likely to be more weakened. And also, I think as an index of geopolitical power, I think the obvious indicator is military spending. And this is the idea of geopolitical power, is the degree to which states are able to exert control over space, both to defend their own territorial integrity and also to project power beyond their state boundaries. And as I said, for geopolitical power, I use the idea of military spending in billions of dollars. And from this, I plotted a diagram, which I hope you can see a little bit. Maybe I have to explain. Yeah, I don't think you can see any of the countries on here, but I can show you them. Along here is the globalization index. So if a country is here at the top, it's very open to globalization. If it's at the bottom here, it's quite close to globalization. Globalization doesn't have a huge impact. Over here is military spending. This is not to scale. This country is the United States. If its military spending was actually, this is China here, this is all correct, but here the scale is reduced. Probably the United States would be almost at the door, because it spends 10 times more than even the other 10 top countries together. The United States still spends more. And China is also a huge spender on military expenditure. But all these are to scale. And basically, here we have most of the European Union countries, we can say. We also have Canada and Australia in this group here. In fact, I will move. Most of the European Union countries are here. Some Asian countries that are in this category would be Malaysia and Singapore. They're very open to globalization, but their military spending is quite small. Here you have countries which I call kind of the have-nots of globalization. They're not very integrated. Of course, we have a range here from the very bottom. This is Ethiopia, towards countries like Mexico and the Philippines, which are a little higher. But they are not as integrated, especially at this position, as other states. And of course, their military spending is low. In this oval here, the green space, we basically have the BRICS: Brazil, Russia. This is Brazil, India. This is Japan, actually, Russia, and China. So that's kind of defined by the BRICS. They are to a degree integrated in the globalization, but all of them have quite high, relatively high military spending. Of course, we have some high military spending here. This is France. The United Kingdom would also be here. Germany, Italy. But over time, their military spending has been reduced since the end of the Cold War, during the process of the European Union. And with the current financial pressures, certainly France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom, their defense spending will undoubtedly decline. So I think these are just typologies. And of course, this is the United States, which is globally integrated, but has a very high military spending. So this is just a collection of states. You could plot all the states in the world, and I think no one state is fixed in these places. States move between them. As I will demonstrate, I think the United Kingdom was once in this position. In the 19th century, it was a great promoter of globalization and free trade with high military spending. Now it would be somewhere over here. This represents, more sort of this is, I think we can say, is a status quo power. It's the world hegemon. It's at the top of the order. These states here, the BRICS, are more aspirational powers. These I call subordinate powers, and most of the states here, they promote a kind of integrationist strategy in the world today, I would say. They're often EU countries. Malaysia and Singapore are ASEAN countries. Canada is, of course, heavily integrated with the United States, in NAFTA, but also with Mexico. And even Australia is is culturally and politically integrated with that.
It was difficult to see.
Yes. If you keep working on this one, that's okay. I will just pretend, we will imagine it's still there. So, I call these states, so I want to come back to these sovereignty regimes. We can imagine this map. And I know it's not perfect. This is just a typology. It's just an abstraction to try to help us understand some of the big processes in the world, some of the groups of countries. As I said, I don't think any state is fixed into these categories. It's not trying to determine that all states are like this or will be like this. But I think it it has some explanational power. And in some cases, some of these states can be, of course, between these categories. Some states move between them. They move from the subordinate to the integrationist. So let's go back to this diagram. Let's talk about the aspirational. I call this the aspirational group. This was the BRICS. This was Brazil, Russia, India, China, and in some cases Japan. These are kind of an aspirational regime, I call them, an aspirational view of their place in the world and their view of how they project sovereignty. So these states, I think, are to a large degree integrated in the global economic system. I mean, Russia and China are both integrated, as is Japan and Brazil. However, they also have a lot of active control over certain flows and processes of globalization. For example, some industries remain within the state control of certain industries. There's restrictions on information flows in some of these countries. There's trade restrictions and currency controls, which we don't see as much in the integrationist regime. They represent also powerful states that employ state sovereignty to restrict some of the process of globalization. And they are also aspirational in that they want to be a regional. Let's come back so we can go to the next slide. This is just the four categories here: the geopolitical powers, high, low, globalization index, high and low, and the four categories. And I talk about the aspirational one at the moment, with high geopolitical power, a lot of military spending, but relatively low. I can't say low, but relatively low globalization index compared to the integrative states or the hegemonic state, which, as you'll see, which I'll explain later, is the United States. So they also have a kind of this high geopolitical power reflects their desires and their urge to be regional dominant in their region, and of course this urge to be dominant, to be the regional hegemon, the regional dominant force, that can also lead to conflicts. The subordinate case, this is down here. Remember, this is the poorer countries. Certainly all of Africa would fit into this. Many poorer states in Asia, and in some poorer states in the Middle East and in South America, Central America particularly, would fit into this subordinate case. And as I said, this emphasizes hierarchy in world politics, that not all states are equal. Sovereignty is not equal in these states to other states. These are the have-nots of globalization. The state's economy are very, very poorly integrated into the world economy. There's very little investment in these countries by transnational companies. In a few states, the countries actually opted out of the international system. Iran and North Korea would be examples of that. They've actually rejected the current international system. And due to their economic weakness, for the most part, their geopolitical power is weak or even non-existent. This means that the state is quite weak, and sometimes the actual state authority is in outside hands, either with neighboring, more powerful states, or even more distant powerful states, or in some cases economically with institutions like the World Bank or the IMF. They don't have control, subordinate states, over their own sovereignty in some ways. They may also be reliant on different groups within their region, the regional groups. They might need to, the state might need, there may be powerful regional, local elites who control economic and social resources. Often these countries have issues with civil wars and even sometimes challenges to the very existence of these states. The third one is this integrative regime, which is highly globalized, but has a relatively low geopolitical power. And I think this is most obviously represented by states that have pooled sovereignty in the European Union and also in other supranational political organizations, organizations above the state. So I think all EU countries fit into this model without a doubt. Certain aspects of sovereignty have been given up. We can see this in the European Union. You can see this in the United Kingdom, my country, and our relationship with the European Union. Certain powers have been given to the European Union Parliament. We know about laws, certain laws, and certain trade rules that our country, the European countries individually have no more control over, other than working together. So they've given up this sovereignty to facilitate cross-border integration, to open access to markets and resources. And of course, even outside of the EU certainly has barriers outside of the EU. But even with these trade barriers and migration barriers, it's still the EU is still China's largest trading partner. Not China's neighbors, not the United States, but the EU as a whole is still China's largest trading partner and the third largest for the United States. And so within these states, I think central state authority is somewhat weaker because we've devolved powers upwards. But military spending is low, and one reason it's low is because of the success of this integration model, I think. In the European Union, there's no more danger of conflict or wars. There is not the need for the military build-ups and investment that we've seen. There's still some colonial legacies in some of these state policies. You know, France and Britain been the most obvious. But for the most part, you know, the geopolitical power is low or declining. And as I mentioned before, Australia, Canada, Malaysia, Singapore would also fit into this category, but they are also, in their own ways, integrated with their own regional bodies or with neighbouring states. So the fourth one is what I call the hegemon, or the kind of globalist regime. And I think the best current example of this, and the only example of the moment, is the United States. Because this is, I think, the effective sovereignty exercised in the United States. The United States really sets the agenda of the world that we live in, to a large degree. It promotes this current globalizing order, this international globalist order, and it promotes it both through cooperation and also through coercion, through force. And we can see this reflected in that it's a huge military spender, but also highly globalized. And the United States foreign policy is to a large degree based on furthering globalization. It promotes open markets, it promotes free trade, it promotes universal human rights, it promotes democracy. These are all kind of features of globalization. And of course this coercion element rests on this huge military superiority of the United States. And its influence, it also has a huge influence on the international system through, as I said, the IMF, through the World Bank, through other organizations. And as I mentioned earlier, I think Britain in the 19th century, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, also had a version of this regime, in that they were both dominant on a global scale, not just on a regional scale, and they tried to recruit other states by cooperation and also by coercion into this regime. They forced borders open. They forced, you know, in the case of, we have many examples of democracy, human rights, opening borders, been forced on other countries by the United States in the last decade. So I think it actively exerts forms of sovereignty beyond its borders. I think that's one of the keys. Definitely projects sovereignty beyond its borders on a large scale, on a global scale. And it exercises this sovereignty through its influence in the monetary system, also through its cultural soft power, and also, as I mentioned, with the threat of military action. So again, these are just schemes, and it's very difficult sometimes to put. Sometimes different states have features of one or two or even three of these typologies. But I think they at least give a continuum and a way of looking at the world, rather than saying sovereignty is all equal or we live in a globalized world. I think we need to problematize and maybe introduce, you know, a more sophisticated thinking about the world we live in today, that it's not just sovereign states, and it's also not just a globalized world that we live in. And so the point is that no state experiences is sovereignty in the same way. All states are subject to geopolitics and to globalization, and this is an attempt to try to understand 4 different categories that can help us understand this. So for the rest of this paper, we're a little behind schedule, but I want to use some examples, particularly the tensions that have come from this, particularly the tensions between the hegemon and the aspirational powers. And I think this is we are seeing this very much in Vladivostok's own backyard, in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea. This is a very contemporary issue, a very hot issue, and it's in the news all the time, and will be, I'm sure, next year and for some years to come. And I want to look at understanding how some of these clashes of sovereignty regimes, or these different interpretations, these different ways and roles of sovereignty are challenging the world order and the regional world order. So if we think, it's now 20 years since the end of the Soviet Union, which really led to a very different kind of world we live in today. The Soviet Union, since its collapse, there was a dramatic reconfiguration of power across the world, and especially in East Asia. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a sudden and dramatic change in the regional order and with regional sovereignty regimes. And at this time, the United States it really became the hegemon within the world. The United States faced no major challenger anymore. The aspirational powers were much weaker. Russia was much weaker. China and India were much weaker at this time. There was no real challenge to the global hegemon. And we had people like Francis Fukuyama writing the end of history. This is this kind of symbol that the world as we know it is over. It's going to be dominated by globalization, led by the United States, made in the United States image of globalization. And if we look at East Asia, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, they were tightly allied and co-opted to this globalist regime. Elsewhere in the region, we had smaller states like Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, the Philippines. They were more of this subordinate regime, where state authority and geopolitical power was constrained or weak. And also during the 1990s in Asia Pacific, we had the consolidation and a new with ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This was not new. This was an organization developed in the late 60s, early 70s. But it became more consolidated. It tried to expand and tried to integrate further. And of course, its members have diverging conceptions of what ASEAN should be. But still, within ASEAN, ASEAN's Track 1 and Track 2 processes, they have an influence on the states within ASEAN. I think we can agree on that to varying degrees. However, as I said, I think it's not the integrationist or the subordinate regime that have challenged the United States' hegemony in the region over the last 10 years. It's been China and China's rise over the last 20 years, and especially the last 20 years. I think also Russia has, in recent years, over the last 10 years, become a more assertive geopolitical power in the region. However, there's a big difference if we look at how China and Russia have managed their relations. If we look at border disputes, these were all resolved in 2004. There seems to be a mutual understanding between conceptions of sovereignty and managing sovereignty between Russia and China. However, in China's relationship with the United States and its other neighbors in maritime borders, the opposite has been true. China and Russia made very pragmatic 50-50 resolutions to their border disputes, but in the maritime case, China has actually, its behavior has been the opposite. It's made a lot of territorial claims on different countries. We can just have a look at some of them here. And this is, I think you can just make out, this red line is the kind of the broad claim that China's made. It's a dashed line. It's not very clear what exactly the exact GPS positions of these claims are. But it makes a broad claim over specific cases, specific islands, including the Spratly Islands and Scarborough Shoal, which is disputed with the Philippines, the Paracel Islands with Vietnam, Macclesfield Bank with Vietnam and the Philippines, Socotra Rock with Korea, and in the East China Sea, also with Senkaku, which is an island which Japan claims. And so we've seen a kind of, an extension really, and certainly a more vocal, the discourse of peaceful rise has been replaced more by a slightly more confrontational approach. And of course these have led to a reaction across the region. And the rest of the paper wants to examine how the United States, as the global hegemon, has reacted to this rise of China. And it's what is very interesting is that the United States has some commentators, and I think, as we will discuss, even up to the highest level, to the State Department and to US policy, some of the thinking of 19th and 20th century geopolitics has actually come back. There's echoes of the past. There's echoes of Great Britain 100 years earlier, which was its own declining hegemon. And we've seen this language with certain US politicians, military officers, and commentators that have talked of geographical pivots, heartlands, and a distinction between land and sea power. And these are really geopolitical visions of an earlier century that have been rehabilitated to some degree in the United States. So, as I said, the economic and military rise of China has provided a source of much concern amongst America's political and intellectual elite over the role of the United States in this region. It's come under increasing pressure from China. And I think some of the interpretations of China amongst commentators, amongst academics, they've also had a profound influence on policy as well within the United States. So I'll skip a little bit of this discussion just because of our incident with the projector, our ongoing troubles with the projector. I will move on, just skip a few pages out, and move on to this this reframing of China by the United States. And I want to go to this reworking of some of the geopolitical ideas of how the last global hegemon, which was Great Britain, how it represented some of the aspirational powers 100 years ago, how it represented Russia, how it represented Germany 100 years ago, and how this language has found its way back into the United States representations of today's aspirational power, its main challenge being China. And I use the work of a chap called Halford Mackinder, who's a very famous geopolitician, and he came up in 1904, which is 105 years ago, with a very nicely titled paper called the Geographical Pivot of History. And this is quite, it's quite an interesting work, and it focuses on, he talks about three great spaces in the world. He talks about the pivot area, which is basically this area here, which is Eurasia, northern Eurasia. And he also calls this the heartland, which he says is represented, this is the continental interior of Eurasia. He talks about the inner crescent, which runs from Western Europe through the Middle East, India and China. And then he talks about the outer crescent, which is the Americas, South Africa, Australia, and crucially Great Britain and Japan. He also puts in this outer crescent. But his idea was that whoever controlled this heartland, this pivot area, would come to dominate the whole world. He made a distinction between sea power and maritime power. But his basic argument was that with the sea power, that ships had made the United Kingdom a great power, that Britain had taken over the world because of its technologies with ships. But he thought in Eastern Europe and in Russia, with the Trans-Siberian to Vladivostok, he thought the geographical pivot of history would shift from the oceans to the land. Because with railroads, they were more effective than sea power at deploying power. And he noted, he said the Russian army in Manchuria, this is 1904, 1904, before the Japan-Russian War. But in 1904, he said the Russian army in Manchuria is as significant evidence of mobile land power as the British army in South Africa was of sea power. So he's describing these shifts in world power. And his idea is that whoever controls this heartland will begin to consolidate space, its power will develop and grow, and it will expand until it gets to the coastal areas, until it gets to the coast of Asia and Europe. And he said that the expansion over the marginal lands, the edge of Eurasia, would allow the vast continental resources to build ships, wood, metals, all the resources you needed. And then when you became a sea power and a land power, then you could control the world. That was his quite simplistic idea of the world. And of course, this was Mackinder, right? He was very fearful of a rising Russia, a rising Germany, and what that would mean for the current British domination of the world. And at the time, of course, Britain, London was looking towards Moscow, Berlin, and Tokyo, with great concern at these new dynamic powers that filled the horizon. And as the leader of this last globalist regime, the leader of this hegemonic regime, Great Britain had a significant interest in preventing the prevailing order changing. Now, of course, I think we can agree Mackinder's ideas didn't work. I mean, the Eurasia, most of Siberia is too icy to do anything, and the history we live in today tells us that it didn't quite work. The Soviet Union controlled all of this territory from the heartland to the seas, and it didn't take over the world. However, what's interesting from my discussion about America and China is how Mackinder's come back. Although Mackinder's ideas, as we said, we can't really see how they work because they didn't. Well, Great Britain declined, but it was more a result of America's rise, and America was on the periphery of Mackinder's model. But 106 years after Mackinder gave this lecture, wrote this paper, there was an article in Foreign Affairs, the main Foreign Affairs commentary magazine in the United States, by someone called Robert Kaplan, who was a very quite controversial but very, very well-known commentator. And he brought these ideas of Mackinder back. He said that he went back to Mackinder and reread Mackinder. In the very last lines of Mackinder, as Kaplan said, had a disturbing reference to China. Mackinder suggested that China, should they expand their power, in the words of Mackinder at the time, they might constitute a yellow peril to the world's freedom because they had an oceanic frontage and a great continent. And of course, this is kind of the racism of the 19th century. But, and Kaplan says, leaving aside this racism, without this racism, which was common, Mackinder had a point. Unlike Russia, which he said was a land power without an oceanic front, or its oceanic front was blocked by ice, China has a 9,000-mile warm coastline with many good harbors, and is both a land and a sea power. And so Kaplan has turned Mackinder's idea on its head, and he kind of suggests on replacing the heartland now to China, shifting the heartland from Eurasia to China. And his aim is, I think, similar to that of Mackinder. Mackinder was not a politician, but he was also a very influential commentator and influenced policies. He was a member of the Royal Geographical Society and an expert on world politics. But Mackinder and Kaplan is almost the same. And instead of using Germany, Japan, or Russia as Mackinder was doing, he believes that Mackinder's heartland theory is useful for interpreting contemporary China. And the interesting thing is that this idea has also been taken up by other people. For example, Patrick Walsh, he was the head of the Pacific Fleet, the US Pacific Fleet in Hawaii, admiral, one of the highest ranking military officials in the United States. He has directly taken up Mackinder's ideas and said that in order for any country to exert its influence beyond its own region, whether economically, politically, diplomatically, or military, it has to have control of a strategic pivot. And this pivot is exactly the same language that Mackinder was using. And he references Mackinder and says that the critical pivot today is now in the South China Sea. Think of all the trade that passes through the South China Sea. Something like half of the world, some figure like a third or half of the world trade passes through this sea and certain straits within this sea. And as Walsh stepped down as commander of the Pacific Fleet, he left behind a proposal that the United States should shift away its focus from Northeast Asia, which had been its focus since the end of the Second World, to Southeast Asia, and particularly the South China Sea, in order to deter China. And in an interview, he said you can precisely apply Mackinder's geographical insights onto Asia. You can identify where this critical node is, this critical pivot, and it's this critical pivot that should determine where US forces should be in the world. And by determining this, you You can keep sea lanes open. This is this kind of globalist idea of open freedom of movement, freedom of trade, networks of globalization. And also you can use it to dissuade China, to prevent China from closing these networks, closing seaways, and shutting off allies of the United States. And Walsh has said that he's discussed this with former prime ministers of Singapore and others who are very interested in the idea he's doing. And he even wrote a strategic paper for the Pentagon. And what is, I think, most interesting about this is how his ideas have been taken up at an even higher level by Hillary Clinton. I mean, we've all heard of this pivot to Asia, this alignment of US forces and US thinking towards Southeast Asia. And in 2011, last year, in Foreign Policy, which is another very popular and influential magazine in the United States foreign policy community, Clinton actually wrote in a few lines that the United States stands at a pivot point. We need to accelerate efforts to pivot to new global realities. And this kind of pivot is not easy, but we have paved the way for it over the last 2.5 years. So I think we see some of these echoes, some of this geopolitical thinking, these echoes in the speeches of key American policymakers. And as I said, much of this pivoting is going to be in the South China Sea. And we've seen the US is going to probably deploy combat ships to Singapore. It already has a relationship with Northern Australia for deploying Marines there. It recently deployed these new aircraft to Okinawa, these Osprey aircraft, very controversially. And even the Secretary of Defense said this year that around 60% of the US fleet would be deployed in the Asia Pacific, a switch, a 10% switch. And I think it's obvious that behind some of these pivots is an attempt by the United States to reassert its globalized, networked, hegemonic order in this region. And such a response, I think, suggests that the tensions between the globalist regime of the United States and the aspirational agenda of China will dominate this region in the coming years. And I think we can see this already, see some of this tension and these challenges in everything from conflicts over trade disputes, exchange rates, valuations of whether the yuan, the Chinese currency, is valued correctly to the dollar. We can see it also in the context of my presentation with the rhetorical and the policy response to China in its surrounding seas, in the South and East China Sea. And other commentators have taken up this idea. There's one director of the Lexington Institute, which is a think tank, an influential think tank in Washington. He said that if China comes to dominate the Western Pacific, it will control the industrial heartland of the global economy. Again, this rhetoric of heartlands and pivots. And he said, not because I believe in geographical determinism, but because the East Asian coast has become literally the center of the global economy. And if China dominates this region, it will therefore dominate the global economy. And he said Mackinder may or not have got the postal codes right, the postal address, but a century after he talked of the global heartland, it really exists today with China at its center. And of course many commentators like Kaplan and others would agree with Thompson's analysis. But Kaplan is certainly, he's very much a geographical determinist. He believes that a country's situation determines everything about it. He even calls China's blessed geography between land and sea as the reason it will stay at the center of global geopolitics in the 21st century. So just a few conclusions. We're coming to the end of our time. I'll just recap some of the things I've said and some of the possibilities for the future. So what I tried to show in the second half of this paper was that the South China Sea is being framed by influential members of the American political and intellectual elite as the geostrategic center of the world. And of course there are varying interpretations. This is not the case that everyone is saying this. Other commentators would argue the opposite. But what I am saying is this certain group have an influence. All foreign policy is debated between different groups. And I think that these more geopolitical commentators put their emphasis on geopolitics. They are, I think, winning the argument in Washington at the moment. And their rhetoric, their language, it really shows the fear over China and the fear of this challenge to the prevailing globalist sovereignty regime of the United States. And as I mentioned here, Mackinder came back, but also other geopoliticians like Alfred Taylor Mann, who I didn't discuss. We skipped over this. But there really is this kind of bringing people back whose ideas we thought were long dead, and they have been long dead, have come back as kind of ghosts to haunt the current contemporary political international relations. And so these ideas of Mackinder have been enthusiastically taken up. And despite the fact that they came from Britain, which was really was anxious about the challenge it's faced over it. 100 years ago, the British Empire was probably the peak of its powers, but after this, it was a slow decline. And people like Mackinder could see this coming. And this is what some people in the United States are kind of reworking today. But my question is, does this rehabilitation of these imperial strategies, does it tell us anything other than these insecurities in the American elite? And is Mackinder's heartland really useful to apply to China? And others have tried to compare the South China Sea to the Caribbean 100 years ago. Is this really useful, or not? And I think in some ways that their framing of the world in this simplistic terms, it actually obstructs, it actually hides some of the real concerns and strategic issues in the region. But I think it does tell us something about the different visions of sovereignty in this region, the different way that sovereignty operates. And I think both the United States and China need to take into account that they're coming from very different, their conceptions of sovereignty and access and networks are very, very different. And I think they also need to take account of China's insecurities. I think that's a very important thing. Because at the moment they're representing China as just aggressive, territorial, whereas they're saying that the United States is the kind of the protector of the global commons, the protector of the seas. It's a benevolent order, a benevolent globalist order. So I think that there's a kind of this prism, this geopolitical prism of Mackinder and Kaplan and these others, and Walsh, and even Clinton, I think, even at this higher level. They're really sometimes hiding some of these other issues and these insecurities. And I think there's kind of an irony that Kaplan talks about this blessed geography, that China is really a land and a sea power, and that this is somehow great, and from this China will go on and change the world. But even Mackinder, 100 years ago, which Kaplan doesn't mention, which he missed, Mackinder, talking about Russia, said that he was very concerned about Russia's rise, but he said Russia can strike on all sides, it can attack on all sides, but it can also be struck on all sides. It can also be attacked from all sides by surroundings. And of course, let's think about China. In China's north, south, and east, there are challenges across its borders. There's separatist challenges in the west. In the south, there is, of course, China on its doorstep, another aspirational power, which has its own interests in regional, regional dominance, regional security. And of course, to its east, it has potential rivals like Japan and, of course, the United States. And I think that I'd like to draw some of the attention to this and say that although China is maybe an aspirational power, it's perhaps worth remembering that some of these territorial activities, some of these aggressive, what's seen as aggressive by commentators in Washington, they maybe show that China's position is not actually from a position of particularly strength, but maybe one more of weakness. And I think at least reframing the question or considering these insecurities and these different conceptions of sovereignty and what it means, I think this can help maybe manage and present new opportunities for security in the region. Because at the moment, we have, I think, a dangerous arms race in this region, and there's a struggle for scraps of land, for rocks in the sea, that are really dangerous and have a potential to be much more really global flashpoints. And I also think I want to finally, the final point is to emphasize that all states also have a choice. I don't think there's some determination to these models, to the realism trumps here. All states have a choice. The aspirational powers, they have a choice, I think, between globalization and geopolitics. And they could choose in different directions to go. And you know, I think another important point to remember is that history tells us, looking back, history can also tell us where some of these ideas come from. And if we look at the current, the global hegemony of Great Britain or empires before it, it does not endure indefinitely. And I think it's important to reflect on this point of history and choice in international relations. And I'll leave it there, and thank you for your attention. And we can take any questions if you're not too enthusiastic to leave.
The question is, will the rise of China lead to new bipolarity in Asia-Pacific, with China being converted into world global power, with Japan's weakening and United States' concern of converting, building new strategy of containment? Is it possible?
I think bipolarity is a difficult concept because it's very difficult to actually say when are they actually when is it actually equal. And I think in the current structure of the world, it's clearly the current alliances that you might see forming. They're currently not, I don't think, at all equal. I think it'd be like the Soviet Union almost, where you have the whole of Western Europe and the whole of the United States and a whole collection of allies. I don't think that was, in many ways, bipolar, actually. I think it was actually quite an equal world. And I think the way I see China at the moment is that would also be the case. If it did pursue and continue pursuing this more geopolitical strategy and wanted to sharpen these differences with Japan, with other countries, I think it would find itself more on its own. I don't think Russia would be rushing in to help. I don't think Russia is, I think Russia is in an important position, as a balancing position, but I don't think it would rush in behind either. You know, it would want to be it would want to not be on either side of this bipolar world. So I don't see that. I mean, I think some of this rhetoric from China and from America as well is, of course, in this context of elections and changes of power, and we shouldn't neglect that. But I think a bipolar world, if the policymakers in China have any understanding of the world, I think if they wanted to pursue this strategy, it wouldn't be a very good one.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah.
Any more?
A couple of questions. What do you think? I think this theory of heartland and pivot area doesn't correspond too much. So this now the Kaplan says that China is kind of pivot area, but then in 10 years it would be India maybe as a pivot area. So what is the criteria? How we can, you know, decide? I mean, if we see about Russia, it's really inside kind of big space. Then next time it may be Portugal or whatever. So what are the criteria for this heartland?
No, I think it's entirely. I mean, I think there is absolutely no criteria. It's a rhetoric. It's a framing of the world. I mean, I think that you could say maybe in 100 years Africa is the heartland because we have solar panel technology there and all energy resources are in the Sahara. Who knows, right? So I think it's just as Mackinder was doing it. This rhetoric, this language, is a way to look at some of the fears amongst the great powers today. And I think the heartland is, it's a fiction. I mean, we all know about it, even at the time of Mackinder writing, that this is just frozen kind of wasteland. The only thing in the pivot area is kind of mammoths, frozen woolly mammoths, and nothing much is really there. There's of course resources there, and maybe again it will be a new heartland because it will be global warming. But who knows? If you ask people like Alexander Dugin, they will say, "Oh, this is the future, Siberia. It's air, fresh air, and space, and this is the future." But I don't know. I think that's also a rhetoric. It's a way of kind of promoting their own interests and their own beliefs. And I think people will leave this as and of course the original heartland was very useful in the Cold War because when Mackinder did this, it was 1904, before the Bolshevik Revolution, before the Soviet Union. And I think it might have died if it wasn't for this, but of course it kind of came back in the 20s and 30s and even in the 40s again. It was reworked by other political geographers. Otherwise it might have been forgotten. But I think it's just a way of a rhetoric, a way of framing the world. But I think there is no basis or criteria to it. But good question, thank you. Any more from the students? Don't be shy. Well, I think you can always have a chat afterwards. I think almost done. I think we'll get back to your normal schedule, and thank you for coming.
Thank you again.
Good luck with it.